Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The scent of stale coffee and newsprint was Chloe's personal perfume, a testament to decades spent chasing stories. At 67, her fingers still flew across the keyboard with a dancer's precision, each tap a declaration of intent. Her apartment, a cavernous space overlooking the ceaseless surge of Manhattan, wasn't just a home, it was a war room. Stacks of meticulously indexed files formed precarious towers, overflowing from filing cabinets that had seen more battles than some generals. Books on corporate law, financial forensics, and international tax havens jostled for space with dog-eared biographies of muckrakers and revolutionaries. There were no decorative trinkets, no sentimental knickknacks, just the tools of her trade, honed and ready. Her current obsession, a sprawling financial fraud weaving its tentacles through offshore accounts and shadowy shell corporations, demanded every ounce of her formidable intellect. The sheer scale of the deception energized her, a complex puzzle only someone with her experience and relentless drive could hope to unravel. She worked 12-hour days fueled by triple espressos and the slow-burning fire of righteous indignation. Her grandnephew Leo, 32, with a shock of unruly brown hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners behind thick-rimmed glasses, was her indispensable ally. He was a wizard with data, capable of sifting through terabytes of financial records to find the single, incriminating thread she needed. Their bond was unconventional, built on mutual respect for intellect and a shared disdain for superficiality. "You're the bloodhound, Aunt Chloe," he'd said once, "and I'm your forensic accountant." It was a compliment she cherished, yet lately a subtle disquiet had begun to permeate her meticulously ordered world. It started insidiously, a persistent, hacking cough that clung to her chest like a damp shroud, refusing to yield to her usual arsenal of over-the-counter remedies. Then came the bruising. Large, mottled purple splotches would appear on her forearms and shins from the slightest bump. Brushing past a door frame, retrieving a file from a bottom drawer. She'd dismiss them with a dismissive wave of her hand, attributing them to clumsiness or thinning skin. The inevitable tolls of age she grudgingly acknowledged but fiercely resisted. The most insidious symptom, however, was the exhaustion. It wasn't the satisfying fatigue that followed a productive day, but a profound, bone-deep weariness that settled in her marrow, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Her beloved espressos, once a potent elixir, now offered only a fleeting, almost imperceptible lift. She rationalized it as the stress of the exposé, the weight of uncovering such pervasive corruption. "You look like a ghost, Aunt Chloe," Leo observed one Tuesday, peering at her over his laptop screen. He'd arrived with a fresh batch of financial data, but his gaze was fixed on her pallor, the faint smudges beneath her eyes. "Seriously, you need to see someone. This isn't just stress." "Nonsense," she'd retorted, her voice raspy. "Just a touch of the flu. I'll work through it." But even as she spoke, she felt a wave of nausea, a sudden lightheadedness that made the room tilt precariously. A few weeks later, the flu escalated into a full-blown pneumonia that clamped her lungs in an iron vise, leaving her gasping for breath, confined to her bed for days. The prescribed antibiotics offered little relief, the cough lingering long after the fever broke, a constant, irritating reminder of her body's betrayal. When she finally emerged, pale and significantly lighter, Leo had taken matters into his own hands. "I've made you an appointment," he announced, setting a folded slip of paper on her desk. "Dr. Aris, downtown. He comes highly recommended." Chloe bristled. "Leo, I don't have time for doctors. This exposé won't write itself." She gestured vaguely at the mountains of files. "Besides, it's probably just a vitamin deficiency. I'll order some supplements." "Aunt Chloe," he said, his voice unusually firm, "you're fading. You've lost weight, you're coughing constantly, and those bruises aren't normal. Please." His earnestness, coupled with her own unsettling awareness of her deteriorating state, silenced her protests. She went grudgingly, dismissing the initial blood tests and physical exam as a waste of her precious time. The call came 2 days later, shattering the quiet hum of her apartment. Dr. Aris's voice was calm, professional, yet laced with a gravity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Ms. Harding, we need you to come in immediately. Your blood work results are concerning." Leo drove her to the clinic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, sensing the unspoken dread that filled the car. She sat stiffly in the waiting room, her journalist's instincts taking over, observing the hushed interactions, the nervous glances. Dr. Aris met them in his office, his expression solemn. He didn't mince words. "Ms. Harding, your tests indicate acute myeloid leukemia, specifically with an FLT3-ITD mutation." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "It's an aggressive form of leukemia. Your white blood cell counts are dangerously high, and your bone marrow is producing abnormal, immature cells." He pointed to a diagram on a screen, illustrating the grotesque proliferation of rogue cells. Without immediate, aggressive chemotherapy, the prognosis is grim. He outlined the standard protocol: intensive induction chemotherapy, possibly followed by a bone marrow transplant. "We need to start treatment as soon as possible. Every day counts." Chloe felt a strange numbness. AML, leukemia. The words hung in the air, clinical and detached. Yet they referred to a tempest raging within her own body. A journalist for decades, she had faced down corrupt politicians, ruthless CEOs, even death threats. She had always controlled the narrative. Now fate had thrust her into a story she hadn't chosen, a protagonist in a biological drama she couldn't script. Then the numbness gave way to defiance. "Standard protocol?" she scoffed, her voice regaining some of its familiar sharpness. "A one-size-fits-all solution? Doctor, I've spent my life exposing the flaws in standard protocols. I don't just accept things at face value." She looked from Dr. Aris to Leo, who sat pale and rigid, his eyes wide with unshed tears. There must be other options. Alternative treatments, clinical trials. Her mind, even in shock, was already racing, cataloging, researching. She would not be just another patient, a passive recipient of medical dictates. She would investigate, interrogate, control this narrative too. No matter how grim the prognosis, she would find her own answer. Leo, watching her, felt a wave of despair. His brilliant, formidable aunt was facing her gravest challenge, and his gut told him her default response, to fight the system, might just be the thing that destroyed her. Her current obsession, a sprawling financial fraud, weaving its tentacles through offshore accounts and shadowy shell corporations, demanded every ounce of her formidable intellect. The sheer scale of the deception energized her, a complex puzzle that only she, with her intricate web of sources and Leo's uncanny data analysis skills, could unravel. Leo, her grandnephew, a man of algorithms and quiet brilliance, was her anchor in the digital storm, his mind a finely tuned instrument that could extract patterns from chaos. Their bond, forged over late-night data dives and shared indignation at injustice, was the closest thing Chloe had to family, a relationship built on mutual respect for intellect and a shared disdain for anything less than empirical truth. Lately, however, truth felt elusive. It began subtly, a persistent tickle in her throat that blossomed into a hacking cough, dry and insistent, that no amount of herbal tea or over-the-counter syrup could quell. She dismissed it as the usual occupational hazard of urban living, another pollutant in the air she breathed, another battle to be waged. Then came the bruises, faint at first like smudges on an old photograph, purplish constellations appearing on her forearms and shins without memory of impact. She'd always been a little clumsy, a byproduct of a mind perpetually elsewhere. But these felt different, less about impact and more about an internal fragility. A slight bump against her desk chair, a brush against a door frame, and a week later, a mottled map would bloom across her skin. But it was the fatigue that truly gnawed at her, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could banish. It wasn't the satisfying exhaustion after a marathon research session, but a profound, debilitating drain that made even lifting her arm feel like an act of Herculean effort. Her usual double espresso, once a potent elixir, now barely registered, leaving her still mired in a fog that blurred the edges of her razor-sharp focus. She attributed it to the relentless pace of her current exposé, the stress of battling shadowy corporations, the inevitable toll of 67 years lived with unyielding intensity. "Just tired, Leo," she'd bark whenever he'd catch her staring blankly at her screen, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside her. "Too many late nights. This fraud isn't going to expose itself." Leo, however, possessed an observational acuity that rivaled her own, albeit applied to different data sets. He noticed the subtle tremor in her hands as she typed, the faint yellow tint to her usually sallow skin, the alarming number of tiny pinprick reddish-purple spots, petechiae, he'd later learn, that peppered her shins, almost like a rash. He noticed how she'd started using the banister, going up the 2 flights to her apartment, something she'd never done before. He noticed the way her breath hitched after a short walk, a wheeze that sounded unnervingly like the early stages of the pneumonia that had laid her low a few months prior, a nasty bout that had clung to her lungs like a stubborn ghost, leaving her winded and weak for weeks. "Chloe," he'd said one evening, his voice unusually firm, "you look gray. You need to see a doctor. This isn't just tired. This is something else." Chloe had snorted, waving a dismissive hand. "Doctors are for hypochondriacs and the genuinely infirm, Leo. I'm a journalist, not a patient. My body is merely protesting being held captive by my mind." But even as the words left her lips, a tremor of unease snaked through her usual confidence. The pneumonia had been particularly brutal, a lingering cough still occasionally racking her frame, and the fatigue, God, the fatigue was becoming a suffocating blanket. She found herself making basic errors in her research, mixing up dates, forgetting names, an unforgivable sin for a journalist of her caliber. Her body, the reliable vessel for her relentless intellect, was betraying her, and the thought filled her with a simmering irritation that bordered on fear. Leo, however, was as tenacious as she was. He booked an appointment, an executive physical, he called it, leveraging his company's benefits with a quiet determination that brooked no argument. "Just a checkup, Chloe, for my peace of mind, if not yours. Think of it as a data acquisition exercise." She went grudgingly, seeing it as a necessary evil, a short detour before returning to the real work. The first doctor, a harried GP, ran a battery of blood tests. The call came 2 days later, not from the GP, but from a specialist. "Miss Sterling," a calm, measured voice said, "Dr. Evans recommended you to me. Your blood work shows some anomalies, significant anomalies. We need you to come in for more immediate, comprehensive testing." The next few days were a blur of sterile rooms, cold machines and hushed voices, bone marrow biopsies, countless vials of blood, CT scans, genetic tests. Chloe, despite the growing dread, found herself unable to fully disengage her journalistic mind. She asked questions, sharp and incisive, about the procedures, the probabilities, the implications. She treated her body as a new investigative subject, demanding facts, data, and irrefutable evidence. Then came the meeting. Dr. Anya Sharma, a young oncologist with kind eyes that belied a steely resolve, sat across from Chloe and Leo in a small windowless office. The air was thick with unspoken words. Dr. Sharma spoke clearly, concisely, her voice devoid of excessive emotion, yet brimming with a quiet gravity. "Ms. Sterling," she began, "the tests are conclusive. You have acute myeloid leukemia, AML, and it's particularly aggressive, with an FLT3-ITD mutation." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and final. "This type of leukemia progresses very rapidly. Without immediate aggressive treatment, specifically intensive chemotherapy, the prognosis is grim, measured in weeks, perhaps a few months at most." Chloe felt a strange sensation, as if her brain had suddenly disconnected from her body. AML, leukemia. The words, once abstract medical terms, now resonated with a terrifying intimacy. She looked at Leo, whose face had gone ashen, his usual composure shattered, replaced by a raw, unadulterated fear that mirrored the abyss opening within her. He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, anchoring her to the present. "Chemotherapy," Chloe finally said. the word tasting like ash. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual journalistic bite. "And what are the success rates for this aggressive treatment, doctor? What are the side effects? What are the long-term outcomes?" Her mind, even in shock, began to categorize, to analyze, to search for the angles. Dr. Sharma met her gaze squarely. For AML with FLT3-ITD, even with aggressive induction chemotherapy, the 5-year survival rate is challenging. We're talking about intensive treatments, significant side effects, nausea, hair loss, profound fatigue, immunosuppression, and there's a high risk of relapse. For a patient of your age, the risks are even higher. The grim statistics, delivered with such clinical precision, fueled a familiar surge of resistance within Chloe. She wasn't a statistic. She was Chloe Sterling, a woman who had spent her life dissecting systems, exposing flaws, and refusing to be defined by anyone else's narrative. This was just another system, another protocol, another attempt to fit her into a predefined box. "So, a one-size-fits-all solution then," she stated, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "Pump me full of poisons, destroy my immune system, and hope for the best, with a high chance of failure and relapse. Is that the sum total of modern medicine's answer to this aggressive mutation?" Leo squeezed her hand tighter, a silent plea. But Chloe was already retreating into the intellectual fortress that had always protected her. "No," she declared, pulling her hand away. "No, I won't be just another patient. I won't be a number in your clinical trials. There are always other options, always. I've spent my life finding the hidden truths, doctor, and I will find them here too." The unacknowledged fear clawed at her, but she masked it with a professional skepticism that had served her well for decades. She would research. She would control her own narrative, even in the face of death. Leo watched her, heartbroken and terrified, knowing her well enough to understand that her defiance was both her greatest strength and perhaps her most dangerous weakness. The news had shattered her carefully constructed world of intellectual control and logical solutions, leaving her to grapple with a reality that defied all her established truths. The cough had become a constant, unwelcome companion, a ragged punctuation mark at the end of every sentence, every thought. It had started as a minor irritation, easily explained away by the perpetual dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, filtering through her uncurtained windows, or the lingering chill of a particularly brutal New York winter. But then came the bruising, faint purple smudges on her forearms, appearing seemingly out of nowhere, deepening after the slightest bump. Once she'd caught her elbow on a doorframe and watched, fascinated and vaguely annoyed, as a dark, angry splotch bloomed beneath her skin like an ink blot. "Just old age," she'd muttered, flexing her arm, dismissing it. "Skin gets thinner, blood vessels more fragile." Then the petechiae started, tiny pinprick red dots, like a rash that wasn't a rash, clustered on her shins. She'd noticed them in the harsh light of her bathroom mirror one morning, after a particularly violent bout of coughing had left her gasping. They didn't itch, didn't hurt, just were. She'd tried to Google them, but her focus was too fragmented, her mind too weary. The weariness, that was the most insidious symptom of all. It wasn't the healthy exhaustion of a long day of intellectual combat, the kind that led to a deep, satisfying sleep. This was a profound, bone-deep fatigue that no amount of coffee could penetrate, no nap could alleviate. It was a leaden cloak clinging to her, dragging her down, making even the simplest task, like walking to the kitchen for a glass of water, feel like an expedition. Her exposé, once a source of boundless energy, now felt like a crushing weight. Her fingers, once so nimble, stumbled over the keyboard. Her thoughts, usually so crisp, were muddled, slow. Leo, always observant, had noticed. He'd started making daily check-in calls, his voice laced with a concern that grated on Chloe's nerves. "Aunt Chloe, you sound weak. Are you eating enough?" "Of course I'm eating enough, Leo. I'm just busy. This exposé isn't going to write itself," she'd snapped, her voice raspy from the cough. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Food held no appeal. The vibrant world of flavors had dulled to a bland, tasteless existence. She'd lost weight, a noticeable amount, though she attributed it to her demanding schedule and the stress of the fraud investigation. The pneumonia had been the final, undeniable alarm. It wasn't just a chest cold, it was a siege. Days blurred into a feverish haze punctuated by shattering coughs that left her breathless, aching. Leo had practically moved in, hovering with lukewarm broth and worried pronouncements. "Aunt Chloe, this isn't just a cold. You need to see a doctor. Now." She'd fought him, of course. "Doctors are for hypochondriacs and the genuinely infirm, Leo. I'm neither. I'm just under the weather." But her defiance rang hollow even to her own ears. The pneumonia lingered, an unwelcome tenant in her lungs, refusing to vacate. Finally, worn down by Leo's relentless insistence and her own physical misery, she relented. "Fine," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Make an appointment. But I'm not spending all day in some waiting room for them to tell me I have a cough." The doctor, a young woman with kind eyes and an irritatingly calm demeanor, had seemed unfazed by Chloe's prickly attitude. She'd listened to Chloe's chest, palpated her lymph nodes, and observed the petechiae with a neutral gaze that Chloe found unsettling. "Your white blood cell count is quite high, Ms. Thorne," she'd said, her voice soft. "And your platelets are very low. We need to do some more tests, immediately. A bone marrow biopsy, a full blood panel." Chloe had bristled. "A bone marrow what? What are you talking about? I have pneumonia." The doctor had simply looked at her, her expression unreadable. "We need to rule out some serious possibilities, Miss Thorne." The days that followed were a blur of sterile rooms, cold instruments, and the dull ache of the biopsy site. Chloe tried to maintain her intellectual distance, viewing the process as a journalist might, observing the mechanisms of a system. But the fear, a cold, insidious dread, began to creep in around the edges of her carefully constructed composure. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Leo was with her, perched on the edge of her worn armchair, meticulously organizing a stack of financial documents for the expose. Chloe was attempting to read a medical journal article about autoimmune diseases, but the words swam before her eyes. "Ms. Thorne? Dr. Lee here. Do you have a moment?" The doctor's voice was too formal, too grave. Chloe's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. "Yes, doctor. What is it?" Leo looked up, his brow furrowed with apprehension. "Ms. Thorne, the results of your tests are back. It's acute myeloid leukemia, AML, and it's an aggressive form with an FLT3 ITD mutation. We need to start treatment immediately. Aggressive chemotherapy is your best, and frankly, only option." The words hung in the air, cold, precise, devastating. Leukemia, the cancer of the blood, AML, aggressive, mutation, chemotherapy. Chloe felt a strange detachment, as if the doctor were talking about someone else. Her, Chloe Thorne, the unshakable, the unyielding. She was a journalist, a truth seeker, not a patient. "Leukemia," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Are you certain?" Her voice, even to her own ears, sounded oddly calm. "The pathology is conclusive, Ms. Thorne. Your bone marrow is infiltrated with blast cells. This is a very serious diagnosis. Without immediate intensive treatment, the prognosis is grim." Leo gasped, a choke sound that tore through Chloe's detachment. He was suddenly beside her, his hand grasping hers, his face pale, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own, a terror she refused to acknowledge. "Grim," Chloe mused almost to herself. "And what does intensive treatment entail, doctor?" She was already slipping into journalistic mode, dissecting the facts, searching for the angles. Dr. Lee explained, her voice softening slightly, the gravity of her words no less impactful. "We'd start with induction chemotherapy, a combination of drugs to kill the leukemia cells. It's a harsh regimen with significant side effects. Hospitalization for several weeks, risk of severe infection, hair loss, nausea." Chloe stopped listening. Chemo, hair loss, side effects. She wasn't a statistic. She wasn't a medical case study. She was Chloe Thorne, and she would not be reduced to a set of symptoms and a prognosis. "So, a standardized protocol," she interrupted, her voice sharper, regaining some of its old bite. A one-size-fits-all solution for a unique individual? Dr. Lee paused. Ms. Thorne, this is the established standard of care for AML with this mutation. It offers the best chance of remission. Chance, Chloe scoffed, the defiance rising, hot and angry, pushing back the fear. Not certainty, and I'm sure there are other options, alternative therapies, experimental treatments. I'm a journalist, doctor. I research. I verify. I don't blindly accept the first narrative handed to me. Leo's grip tightened on her hand. Aunt Chloe, please, listen to her. This isn't a story. This is your life. Chloe ignored him, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of her apartment, beyond the grim pronouncements. Thank you for the diagnosis, doctor. I'll be in touch. I need to process this, do my own research. She hung up, a decisive click that severed the connection to the medical establishment, to the grim reality they offered. She turned to Leo, her eyes blazing, not with fear, but with a fierce, almost manic determination. They think they can just label me, Leo. Put me in a box. Tell me how my story ends. But they don't know Chloe Thorne. I write my own chapters, every single one. Her carefully constructed world of intellectual control and logical solutions was shattered. Yes, but not broken. It was merely rearranged. And in the rearrangement, a new desperate and dangerous form of control was already taking root. Acute myeloid leukemia, the oncologist Dr. Anya Sharma had pronounced, her voice devoid of inflection, a well-worn path through grim prognoses. FLT3-ITD mutation. Aggressive. We need to start chemotherapy immediately. Chloe had stared at her, not with fear, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a journalist sizing up a dubious source. Immediate, she'd echoed, the word tasting like a prepackaged truth she was predisposed to dissect. Based on what? A single set of labs? Your standard protocol is a one-size-fits-all solution, Dr. Sharma. I don't fit into neat categories. Leo, perched anxiously on a plastic chair beside her, had squeezed her hand, his face a pale mask of terror. Chloe, please. She's a doctor. She knows what she's doing. Chloe had merely arched an eyebrow, a silent challenge to his naivete. Her initial numbness had quickly curdled into defiance, a familiar, almost comforting surge of intellectual rebellion. They wanted to inject her with poisons, to strip her body bare, to make her a statistic. She would not be reduced. She would control her own narrative, even if it was the story of her own demise. And so, true to her nature, Chloe threw herself into researching AML with the same intensity she'd applied to the sprawling financial fraud that now seemed ludicrously trivial. Her apartment, once a chaotic but organized repository of corporate malfeasance, transformed into a biological battleground. Stacks of medical journals replaced SEC filings. The sharp scent of freshly printed newsprint gave way to the faint, medicinal tang of herbal concoctions and the almost metallic tang of kale in spirulina smoothies. She scoured PubMed for clinical trials, dismissing anything that didn't offer a radical departure from the mainstream. She dove into the murky waters of alternative therapy websites, a strange intellectual paradox at play. Her innate skepticism, honed over decades of debunking charlatans, should have screamed at the unsubstantiated claims of colloidal silver and apricot kernels. Yet her distrust of established institutions, the very system she'd spent a lifetime investigating, ironically made her more receptive to these unproven alternatives. If the traditional path was part of the problem, perhaps the solution lay in its antithesis. This, she declared to a bewildered Leo, holding up a dog-eared book on ancient Chinese medicine, is about rebalancing the body's qi. Chemotherapy blasts the entire system, a scorched earth policy. This is about nurturing. Leo, ever the pragmatist, had tried to interject. Chloe, I've cross-referenced some of these studies with peer-reviewed data. Most of them are anecdotal or funded by the very companies selling the supplements. There's no empirical evidence they work, and some could actively interfere with legitimate treatments. Chloe had merely waved a dismissive hand, stirring a murky green concoction in a blender. Empirical evidence? Leo, the medical establishment is a behemoth, funded by pharmaceutical giants. Their evidence is often skewed to promote their own patented drugs. You, of all people, should understand how data can be manipulated. I'm looking for truth, not propaganda. Her self-imposed isolation deepened. She refused Dr. Sharma's increasingly urgent phone calls, responding only with curt, emailed demands for more detailed lab reports, which she then subjected to her own amateur analysis. Her combative interactions with the oncologist became legendary among the ward staff. A tiny, gaunt woman, eyes burning with intellectual fire, lecturing highly credentialed physicians on the shortcomings of their scientific methodology. She saw them not as healers, but as cogs in a system, complicit in its limitations. Dr. Sharma, your reliance on a bone marrow biopsy as the sole diagnostic gold standard is, frankly, archaic, she'd once stated during a brief acrimonious consultation, citing a forgotten article on liquid biopsies she'd found online. Dr. Sharma, a woman of immense patience, had simply sighed and reaffirmed the urgency of her situation. Chloe, your white blood cell count is climbing. Your blast count is dangerously high. This isn't a theoretical debate. This is your life. But Chloe was deaf to such pleas. She embarked on a self-prescribed regimen that would have horrified any nutritionist. Extreme dietary changes, eliminating everything she deemed acidic or inflammatory, left her perpetually hungry and weak. Esoteric supplements, ordered from obscure websites, filled her kitchen counter. Bottles of black seed oil, high-dose vitamin C, apricot kernel extract, and a truly foul-tasting concoction advertised as a heavy metal detox. Her once sharp focus on the corporate fraud expose withered, replaced by an almost obsessive dedication to her own internal landscape. A fortress she was determined to defend on her own terms. Leo, watching from the periphery, was a study in profound frustration and helplessness. He brought her groceries, cooked bland meals she often refused, and tried to engage her in logical arguments, citing studies, showing her data, all of which she dismissed as biased or incomplete. He saw the increasing pallor of her skin, the alarming weight loss, the faint but distinct scent of illness emanating from her. He saw the petechiae spreading, not just on her shins, but now dotting her arms, her chest. He saw her growing fatigue, the way she would slump into her armchair after just a few hours of research. Her eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Chloe, you look worse," he dared to say one evening, watching her struggle to open a jar of homemade sauerkraut. She'd glared at him, her eyes sharp despite her obvious weakness. "That's part of the process, Leo. My body is purging toxins. It's a healing crisis." But the crisis felt less like healing and more like a descent. Her intellectual arrogance, once a shield, was becoming a self-destructive blindfold. The sense of control she derived from her research was a desperate illusion, masking a deep, unacknowledged fear. She was charting her own course all right, but it felt terrifyingly like sailing straight into a storm she refused to believe was coming. The whispers of her body were growing louder, transforming into a roar she could no longer ignore. Her carefully constructed world of intellectual control beginning to fray at the edges. Despite her rigorous alternative regimen, fueled by a potent cocktail of distrust and desperate hope, Chloe's condition visibly worsened. The initial burst of intellectual energy that had propelled her through countless medical journals and obscure online forums had long since dissipated, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made even lifting her head from the pillow an Herculean effort. The petechiae, once confined to her shins, had blossomed into angry constellations across her chest and arms, mingling with alarming new bruises that appeared without explanation. Her skin, once a healthy if somewhat pale canvas, now had a translucent, waxy sheen, almost like old parchment. The supplements, a dizzying array of tinctures, powders, and capsules, sat mostly untouched in their amber bottles on her bedside table, a testament to her failing resolve. The carefully researched dietary changes, the alkaline water, the raw vegan meals, the endless green smoothies, had become a cruel joke. Another infection, a particularly aggressive oral thrush, had taken root, coating her tongue and throat in a thick, white fungal layer that made swallowing anything, even her own saliva, an agony. The thought of another kale smoothie made her stomach roil. Food, once a mere necessity, had become an enemy. Her once sharp mind, her most prized possession, the engine of her entire being, was now as clouded and sluggish as a swamp in late summer. Words shimmered on the page, refusing to coalesce into meaning. Her meticulously organized research notes, once a source of comfort and control, now seemed like an impenetrable hieroglyphic script. She tried to read, to absorb, to find that one golden nugget of information that would unlock the secret to her healing, but the sentences would blur, her eyelids would grow heavy, and she'd drift into a fitful, unrefreshing sleep, punctuated by the ragged wheeze of her breath. The phone, usually a tool for dissection and interrogation, lay silent. She'd stopped answering Leo's increasingly frantic calls, the concern in his voice a mirror she couldn't bear to look into. His worried visits, initially a source of irritation, then a fleeting comfort, had become another burden. He'd arrive with fresh groceries she couldn't eat, with printouts of new clinical trials she couldn't focus on, with eyes full of a raw, desperate love that only amplified her own despair. She saw in his face the stark reality of her decline, a truth she was desperately trying to outwit. One particularly grim afternoon, the late autumn light weak and watery through her grimy windows, Chloe found herself staring at her reflection in the darkened glass. It wasn't just the physical deterioration that shocked her, it was the hollowness in her eyes, the utter defeat that had settled over her features. The carefully constructed edifice of her intellectual superiority, her belief in her ability to control her destiny through sheer force of will and rigorous research, was crumbling. She had always prided herself on being rational, on seeing through the illusions, on exposing the unvarnished truth. And here was the truth. She was dying, and all her intellect, all her research, all her defiance had done nothing but hasten the process, leaving her isolated and utterly, terrifyingly alone. A wave of nausea, sharp and sudden, gripped her. She stumbled to the bathroom, collapsing before the toilet, her body racked by dry heaves. There was nothing left to expel, only the bitter taste of bile and the acrid tang of self-loathing. As the spasm subsided, she found herself slumped against the cool porcelain, tears hot and humiliating, streaming down her face. It was the kind of raw, unvarnished fear she had spent a lifetime bearing beneath layers of journalistic cynicism and intellectual pursuit. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling over the cold plastic. The screen glowed, illuminating Leo's last unanswered call. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pressed his name. It rang twice. Then his voice, tight with anxiety, answered. "Chloe, are you there? Are you okay?" Her voice, when it emerged, was a whisper, raspy and thin, a mere ghost of its former power. "Leo," she began, the single word a profound admission of vulnerability. "Leo, I'm scared." The words hung in the air, a terrifying confession from a woman who had never admitted fear to anyone, least of all herself. It was the unraveling thread, the first crack in the impenetrable fortress she had built around her soul. And in that moment of raw, unmitigated terror, something shifted infinitesimally within her. She had reached the bottom of her intellectual rabbit hole, and staring back at her was not a solution, but the terrifying reflection of her own mortality. The persistent, cloying sweetness of oral thrush had been the final, humiliating straw. It coated her tongue, making every swallow an act of exquisite agony, turning even sips of water into a struggle. The once sharp edges of her mind, her most prized possession, had softened, blurred by the constant thrum of pain and the insidious fog of illness. Researching, once her refuge and weapon, now felt like slogging through quicksand. The medical jargon, once so clear, turned into an unintelligible hum, the words blurring on the screen. The crisis of faith wasn't just intellectual anymore. It was profoundly physical. The body, her ultimate betrayer, had dragged her mind down with it. "Chloe," Leo had pleaded, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear, kneeling by her bed as she drifted in and out of a shallow sleep, her breath catching in her throat with an almost imperceptible wheeze. "Please, let me take you to the hospital. Not for chemo, I promise. Just for help. for comfort. They can make you comfortable. She had merely blinked, a slow, lizard-like movement, the effort of forming words too great. But in that blink, Leo saw a flicker of something new. Not defiance, not intellectual disdain, but a profound, desperate weariness. It was the crack in her fortress he had been waiting for. The palliative care ward at St. Jude's wasn't what Chloe had imagined. There were no harsh fluorescent lights, no relentless beeping of machines. Instead, soft, indirect lighting illuminated gentle watercolors on the walls, and the air was hushed, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices or the soft roll of a gurney. It felt less like a battlefield and more like a quiet harbor, a place where the storm had passed, leaving only the gentle lapping of waves. She was wheeled into a room with a large window overlooking a small, meticulously kept garden. A nurse, a woman named Maria with kind, deep-set eyes, smiled warmly, her touch surprisingly gentle as she adjusted Chloe's pillows. "Welcome, Chloe. My name's Maria. We're going to make sure you're comfortable here." Chloe could only manage a weak nod, the words caught somewhere between her swollen throat and her exhausted brain. She felt like a ship, stripped of its sails, drifting aimlessly. Her body was a foreign land, hostile and unfamiliar. For the first few days, Chloe did little more than sleep, roused only from medication or the occasional, painful attempt to eat. Her world shrank to the four walls of her room, the rhythmic creak of the IV stand beside her, and the hushed whispers of the nurses. Leo visited daily, quiet and watchful, often just sitting by her bed, reading aloud from an old forgotten novel, a habit they'd shared since he was a boy. The words, though she barely registered their meaning, were a balm, a familiar anchor in the shifting sands of her consciousness. Then one afternoon, the door creaked open, and a new presence entered her periphery. He was an older man, thin and frail, with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes that sparkled with an unexpected vivacity. He was being pushed in a wheelchair by a younger nurse. "Ah, there she is, the new resident journalist," he chuckled, his voice surprisingly rich despite a persistent cough. "Maria tells me you wield a mighty pen. I, alas, wielded chalk and a rather dusty blackboard for most of my life." Chloe, startled, managed to open her eyes. He was wheeled to the armchair by her window, positioning himself so he could see both her and the garden. "My name's Elias Thorne," he announced, extending a bony hand. "Retired English professor. Lung cancer, you see. Smoked like a chimney for 50 years. Foolish, foolish man." He offered a self-deprecating smile. Chloe merely stared, too weak to engage, too bewildered by his directness. "Don't mind Elias, Chloe," Maria interjected softly. "He's our resident storyteller. Keeps everyone entertained." Elias waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense, Maria. I merely recount the absurdities of a life poorly lived, yet strangely cherished. And you, Chloe, what tales do you carry?" Chloe wanted to retort, to dismiss him with a sharp journalistic barb, but the words wouldn't come. Her intellectual armor, once impenetrable, had rusted and crumbled. She merely closed her eyes, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But Elias didn't leave. He began to speak, not to her directly, but to the room, to the garden, to the very air. He spoke of his childhood in a small Welsh village, of his first love, a girl with fiery red hair and a laugh like wind chimes. He recounted his years teaching Chaucer to bewildered undergraduates, the thrill of discovering a forgotten poem, the crushing disappointment of a failed marriage. His stories were not about grand events or heroic deeds, but about the quiet, often mundane beauty and heartbreak of ordinary life. He spoke of regret, of missed opportunities, of the unexpected joys found in the small gestures of kindness. He never asked Chloe to respond, never pressed her. He simply wove his narratives, his voice a gentle, rhythmic hum that filled the quiet room. Sometimes he'd pause, his gaze fixed on the garden, lost in a memory, then pick up the thread again, seamless and unhurried. Chloe, too weak to read, too fatigued to even form complete thoughts, found herself listening. At first it was passive, a mere background noise, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stories began to seep into her consciousness. She pictured the Welsh village, felt the damp chill of the morning mist, heard the distant bleating of sheep. She saw the fiery-haired girl, felt the awkward blush of first love. Elias's words painted vivid pictures in her mind, a stark contrast to the sterile, clinical language of her illness. He wasn't talking about curing, about fighting, about winning. He was talking about living, about the messy, beautiful, flawed tapestry of a human existence, right up until the very end. He spoke of his fear, yes, but also of a surprising peace he was finding in letting go. One afternoon, a particularly painful wave of nausea washed over Chloe. She groaned, clutching her stomach. Maria was there in an instant, administering medication, her touch cool and comforting. When the wave passed, Chloe opened her eyes to see Elias watching her, his own eyes filled not with pity, but with a quiet understanding. "Ah, the body's cruel tricks," he murmured. "It humbles us, doesn't it? Strips away all pretense, leaves us with nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth of our own fragility." He paused, then continued, his voice softer now. "But even in that fragility, there is a story, perhaps, especially in that fragility." Chloe managed a whisper, the first words she had spoken clearly in days. What story is that, Elias?" He smiled, a tired but genuine warmth spreading across his face. "The story of connection, my dear. Of how, when all else is stripped away, we are left with each other. And that, I've found, is quite enough." His words hung in the quiet room, echoing in Chloe's mind. She had spent a lifetime seeking truth in facts, in evidence, in the cold, hard logic of the world. But here, in this quiet sanctuary, listening to a dying man's tales, she felt a different kind of truth resonating within her. A deeper, more profound truth that bypassed the intellect and settled directly into the aching, vulnerable core of her being. The journalistic instinct, that restless urge to document and understand, stirred within her, but it felt different now. It wasn't about exposing, but about bearing witness. Not about control, but about connection. And for the first time in a very long time, it didn't feel like a burden, but a whisper of something alive. Leo's desperate plea had been a lifeline, thrown just as Chloe felt herself slipping beneath the waves of pain and despair. She had nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her head, the effort monumental. He hadn't asked for a promise about chemo again, just help and comfort. And for the first time in months, the word didn't trigger her usual defiance. It sounded like something she desperately needed. The palliative care ward at St. Jude's wasn't what she'd imagined. No sterile white walls or beeping machines. Instead, soft muted colors, sunlight filtering through wide windows overlooking a small manicured garden, and a quiet hum of activity that felt more like a library than a hospital. Leo, his face etched with relief and exhaustion, had overseen her transfer, ensuring her few precious books and her old but reliable tape recorder were by her bedside. She was too weak to read, too weak even to record her own thoughts, but their presence was a small comfort, an anchor to her former self. Her first days were a blur of pain management and sleep. Nurses, their voices soft and movements gentle, administered medications that finally dulled the incessant ache in her bones and cleared some of the thrush, allowing her to swallow sips of cool water without agony. Doctors made rounds, their questions kind but brief, accepting her refusal of aggressive treatment without argument, focusing instead on comfort and dignity. It was a stark contrast to the combative exchanges she'd had with previous oncologists, and it disarmed her. It was on her fourth day, during a brief period of lucidity, that she first truly registered Elias. He occupied the bed opposite hers, separated by a thin, retractable curtain that was usually pulled back. He was an older gentleman, perhaps a decade her senior, with a shock of unruly white hair and kind, intelligent eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His breathing was often labored, punctuated by a dry, rattling cough, but his voice when he spoke was surprisingly clear, imbued with the rich cadences of a man who loved words. He often had visitors, a daughter who brought him crossword puzzles, a grandson who read aloud from a worn copy of Moby Dick. But it was when he was alone, or when a nurse was attending to him, that he truly came alive. He didn't monologue, He simply reminisced, often to no one in particular, sometimes to a passing nurse, sometimes, Chloe suspected, just to the air. His stories weren't grand narratives of heroism or adventure, but quiet, poignant vignettes of a life lived. He spoke of growing up in rural Ireland, the smell of peat fires, the chill of winter mornings. He recounted his academic career in painstaking detail, describing the frustrating nuances of 18th century English literature, the joy of a student's sudden understanding. He spoke of his late wife, Eleanor, with a tenderness that made Chloe, for the first time in years, acknowledge a pang of loneliness. He spoke of his regrets, a book he never finished, a harsh word spoken in haste, but always, he returned to moments of quiet beauty. The way the light fell through the stained glass window in his study, the taste of Eleanor's apple pie, the simple satisfaction of a well-turned phrase. Chloe, usually so impervious to anything that wasn't fact-checked and verified, found herself listening. She couldn't help it. Her mind, too fuzzy for abstract thought, latched onto the concrete details of his narratives. She imagined the damp Irish air, saw the light through the imagined stained glass. There was no agenda in his stories, no attempt to convince or persuade, just the raw, unfiltered truth of a life reaching its end. He wasn't talking about curing anything. He was talking about living until the end. And in a strange way, that felt more profound, more real than any of the miracle cures she desperately chased. One afternoon, Leo arrived to find Chloe, her eyes closed, a faint smile playing on her lips. Elias was recounting a particularly vivid anecdote about a disastrous fishing trip with a colleague. He fell in, hook, line, and sinker. Elias chuckled, a wheezy sound that ended in a cough. Came up sputtering, looked like a drowned rat, but he still had that trout clutched in his hand. Stubborn old fool. Leo, surprised to see his aunt so relaxed, pulled up a chair. He's a storyteller, isn't he? He whispered. Chloe opened her eyes, a flicker of her old sharpness returning. He's a chronicler, she corrected, her voice raspy but stronger than it had been. Of the mundane, the forgotten, the texture of a life. She paused, a thought forming, tentative but persistent. He makes you see it. The idea, once planted, began to germinate in the fertile ground of her enforced idleness. Her own expose, the colossal financial fraud, seemed distant, irrelevant. What was a multi-million-dollar scam compared to the smell of Eleanor's apple pie? She was too weak for anything rigorous, but a different kind of curiosity, one she hadn't recognized in herself before, began to stir. It wasn't about facts, not precisely. It was about narrative, the human narrative. She started small. One morning when the ward was quiet and Elias was dozing, she beckoned a passing nurse, a kind woman in her mid-40s named Maria, whose hands were always gentle when she adjusted Chloe's pillows. Maria, Chloe whispered, her voice surprisingly clear. Tell me, what brought you to nursing? Maria, momentarily startled, smiled. Oh goodness, a long story, Chloe. My grandmother, she was a midwife back in the old country. And Maria began to speak, not of medical protocols or shift changes, but of her grandmother's calloused hands, of new life entering the world, of quiet dignity in the face of suffering. Chloe listened, truly listened, for the first time in what felt like forever. Not as an interviewer seeking data points, but as a fellow human being, thirsty for connection. Later that week, she asked Leo to bring her tape recorder closer. She still couldn't hold it for long, but she could press the record button. Her first interview was with Elias. Professor, she managed, her throat still sore, you have a remarkable way with words. Have you ever considered documenting your experiences? Elias's eyes twinkled. Ah, Miss Chloe, I've tried. But the words, they get stuck in the throat, you see. And the hand, it shakes too much now. I could help, Chloe offered. A surge of energy, faint but unmistakable, coursing through her. If you wouldn't mind, I could listen. Leo could transcribe. Elias considered her, a knowing look in his eyes. A new project, then, for the journalist? Chloe shook her head slowly. No, not a journalist. Just a witness. A chronicler, as you say. And so it began. Very slowly, with immense effort, Chloe started to document the lives around her in the ward. She didn't approach it with her old, aggressive, investigative zeal. There were no hidden agendas, no exposés. Her questions were simple, open-ended. What's your earliest memory? What brings you joy? What do you wish you had done differently? Leo became her indispensable assistant, meticulously transcribing the faint recordings, ensuring the tape recorder was charged, even fetching her a new, softer microphone that wouldn't irritate her weakened hands. He watched, fascinated, as his aunt, who had seemed to shrink into herself, began to unfurl. She interviewed Sarah, a young mother with a rare autoimmune disease, her body ravaged but her spirit surprisingly vibrant. Sarah spoke of her daughter Lily with an incandescent love that transcended her pain, detailing Lily's infectious laugh, the way her tiny hands clutched her finger, the simple miracle of a child's existence. Chloe found herself tearing up, something she hadn't done in decades. There was Arthur, an elderly veteran with advanced dementia, whose mind drifted between lucid moments and a fog of confusion. He couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast, but he could recount, with startling clarity, the horrors and camaraderie of his time in Korea, the smell of gunpowder, the loyalty of his squad. Chloe listened with a reverence she hadn't thought herself capable of, recognizing the profound significance of preserving these fragmented yet vital memories. And then there was Beatrice, a cynical, sharp-tongued artist with pancreatic cancer, whose wit was as cutting as her prognosis was grim. Beatrice spoke of her defiant bohemian life, her struggles with recognition, her one true love, the visceral act of creation. "The world's a messy place, Chloe," Beatrice rasped, a wry smile playing on her lips. "But a good brushstroke, that's eternity, isn't it?" Chloe found herself nodding, understanding, not just intellectually, but deep in her marrow. For the first time, Chloe's focus was entirely outward. It wasn't about her illness, her past, her desperate search for a cure. It was about the truth of others' experiences, the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking tapestry of human lives. The physical exertion of this new work was immense. Holding the microphone, focusing her hearing, formulating questions. Yet paradoxically, it felt less taxing than her previous frantic research. It was as if by giving voice to others, she was, in some inexplicable way, finding her own. A nascent sense of purpose, fragile but growing, began to fill the void that despair had carved out within her. The ward, once a place of resignation, was slowly transforming into a living archive. And Chloe, the chronicler, was finally beginning to understand that the greatest stories were not found in facts or figures, but in the echoes of shared human experience. And in those echoes, a faint, almost imperceptible rekindling of her own life force began to glow. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator had become the new soundtrack to Chloe's existence, a constant reminder of her body's failing rebellion. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting angles of the sunlight across the palliative ward and the hushed movements of nurses. Elias, her gentle storyteller from across the hall, had faded, his bed now occupied by a new, anonymous presence. Chloe herself was a ghost, a thin, papery shell. The oral thrush, though managed with medication, had left her mouth raw and sensitive, making even the softest pureed foods a challenge. Her skin, once a canvas for petechiae, was now mottled with larger, angry bruises, the telltale sign of plummeting platelet counts. Leo, ever present, sat by her bed, his hand often resting on her skeletal arm, a silent anchor in her drifting consciousness. Then came the tremor. Not just a shiver from the perpetual chill that seemed to emanate from her bones, but an internal vibration that intensified, shaking her from within. Her vision, already blurry, splintered into kaleidoscopic fragments. The soft hum of the oxygen machine morphed into a roaring gale, and the gentle voices of the nurses became distant echoes, submerged beneath a rising tide of sound. "Chloe, can you hear me?" Leo's voice, once so clear, was now a garbled whisper, like a transmission from a distant galaxy. His face, contorted with fear, swam in and out of her vision, framed by an increasingly urgent flurry of activity around her bed. Doctors, their faces grim, moved with a terrifying precision, their words like sharp, unintelligible jabs. Septic shock. Plummeting counts. We're losing her. The fragments of sentences, though distorted, were enough. A cold, analytical part of her mind, stubbornly clinging to life, recognized the terminology. This was it, the final act. But then, the roaring gale began to carry voices, not from the room, but from within her own fractured mind. And the way her grandmother would hum as she braided her hair, a song without words, just a feeling of warm safety. That was the young mother, Sarah, her voice strong, vibrant, recounting her childhood. Chloe felt a flash of warmth, a yearning for that simple, unburdened touch. Is the smell of salt and diesel, the roar of the engines, sailing out into the gray Atlantic, knowing you were just a tiny speck, but part of something vast. Elias, his voice clear as a bell, filled her ears. She could almost taste the salt on her lips, feel the spray on her face, a surge of exhilarating freedom, so unlike the suffocating confinement of her body. They said I couldn't paint with these hands, not anymore, trembling like a leaf, but I showed them, didn't I? Found a way to hold the brush, even if it was just with my teeth. The cynical artist Arthur, his gruff voice laced with a defiant pride. Chloe felt a surge of admiration, a spark of his stubborn will igniting within her, and then, deeper, more unsettling. The way the light fell through the dusty attic window, illuminating the motes dancing in the air, but not the little wooden box she'd hidden, the one with the ribbon. This wasn't a patient's story, this was her own. A memory she hadn't consciously thought of in decades. The box, the ribbon, the stifled sobs echoing from the room next door, the hushed voices of her parents, their faces etched with a grief she hadn't understood then, couldn't articulate now. Her older sister Lily, frail, often sick, the undiagnosed illness, the sudden, swift departure, the crushing silence that followed. The way her parents had never spoken of it again, bearing the sorrow deep, forcing a normalcy that felt like a lie. Chloe, a child, had sought answers, not for Lily, but for the inexplicable silence, for the terrifying unpredictability of life, for the lack of control. This, then, was the root, the lifelong quest for certainty, for control, for the truth that would explain away the unbearable fragility of existence. The hallucinations intensified, a swirling vortex of faces and voices, a cacophony of joy and sorrow, triumph and despair. Her own life, raw and exposed, the thrill of her first investigative scoop, the sting of a betrayal, the quiet comfort of Leo's presence, from his awkward childhood to his unwavering support now. Each narrative thread, from her patience and from her own past, wove together, not into a coherent tapestry, but a vibrant, pulsating chaos. The physical distress was immense, a searing fire in her blood, her breath ragged, shallow. She felt herself slipping, falling into a deep, dark well. But the voices, the stories, they clung to her, pulled at her, like invisible hands reaching out from the edge of the abyss. Tell my story, Chloe. Make it real. Sarah's voice clear as a bell. Don't let my memories die with me. Elias. Someone needs to know what it was like. Truly know. Arthur. And then, a tiny fragile whisper, almost imperceptible, yet resonating with an ancient, forgotten pain. Don't let me be forgotten. Lily. A desperate primal urge surged through Chloe, an instinct not for survival, but for connection, to bear witness, to hold these narratives, these lives within her. It wasn't about control anymore, or answers. It was about shared humanity, about the indelible mark each life left on the world, even the quiet ones, even the forgotten ones. She had spent her life dissecting facts, seeking proof, but these stories, these raw, unfiltered expressions of human experience, they were the truest things she had ever encountered. And for the first time, she wasn't researching them. She was feeling them. She was part of them, A jolt, a sudden sharp pain, a gasp. The roaring gale subsided, replaced by the familiar hiss of the oxygen. The kaleidoscope of images coalesced, slowly, into the worried, tear-streaked face of Leo, hovering above her. The doctors were still there, their expressions a mixture of shock and cautious optimism. "Her vitals are stabilizing," one murmured, disbelief lacing his tone. "White count is unexpectedly up. Not much, but it's a turn." Chloe's throat was dry, her body wrung out, but the chaotic, beautiful symphony of stories still echoed in her mind. She couldn't speak, but her eyes, though still unfocused, met Leo's. In that gaze, a silent promise passed between them. She was still here, and she had work to do. Not the work of dissection and exposure, but the profound, sacred work of bearing witness. The physical crisis had passed, leaving in its wake not just exhaustion, but a faint, astonishing whisper of something new. A narrative not yet written, but profoundly felt. The tremor escalated into a full-body convulsion, her senses spiraling into a maelstrom of distorted perceptions. The quiet hum of the concentrator morphed into a deafening roar. The muted light from the window fractured into blinding shards. Faces swam in and out of view. Leo's anguished eyes, a nurse's worried frown, Elias's kind, spectral smile. Words, fragmented and disembodied, echoed in the cacophony. Sepsis, shock, platelets critically low. She registered the frantic movements around her, the cold press of a blood pressure cuff, the sharp sting of an IV being inserted into a vein that felt impossibly fragile. Each touch, each sound was an assault, pushing her further into the abyss. Then came the voices, not external, but internal, a chorus of narratives she had meticulously collected. The young mother recounting the agony of watching her child struggle for breath, her voice raw with a love that transcended despair. The elderly veteran, his gravelly tones painting vivid pictures of forgotten battlefields, of camaraderie and terror, and the quiet dignity of survival. The cynical artist, his sarcastic wit a thin veil over profound vulnerability, detailing the vibrant palette of his life, even as it faded to gray. These were not just stories anymore. They were living, breathing entities within her, intertwined with her own memories. The memories pressed in, particularly ones she'd buried so deep it felt like another's. Annie, her younger sister, 7 years old, her laughter a bright chime in their childhood home, suddenly silenced by an insidious, nameless illness. The doctors, baffled, had offered no explanations, no cures. Chloe, a precocious 10-year-old, had felt a desperate, visceral need to understand, to find the why, to impose order on the chaos of Annie's fading light. That raw, unfulfilled need had calcified into a lifelong obsession with truth, with facts, with control. If she could only uncover enough information, she could prevent, she could predict, she could protect. It was a shield, a fortress against the terrifying randomness of existence. And now, lying on the precipice, that fortress was crumbling, revealing the trembling, vulnerable girl beneath. The stories and memories swirled, indistinguishable, a tapestry of human experience. She was the young mother, feeling the fierce protective love. She was the veteran, facing the impossible. She was Annie, small and helpless against an unseen enemy. And then, a new voice, clear and resonant, cut through the din. It was her own, not the investigative journalist, not the dying patient, but a core, elemental Chloe, recognizing a profound truth. The search for why had been a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. The truth she had always sought was not a definitive answer, but the shared vulnerability of the human condition, the messy, beautiful, terrifying act of living and dying. And in bearing witness to others' struggles, she had, paradoxically, found a release from her own. A jolting gasp, and Chloe's eyes snapped open. The world was still blurry, but the cacophony had receded to a dull hum. Leo's face, etched with lines of exhaustion and fear, hovered above her. "Chloe?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Are you with me?" She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped. He pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "The doctors, They were so worried, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Septic shock. Your counts dropped to nothing. He paused, swallowing hard. They said, prepare for the worst. But the worst hadn't come. Days later, measured in fitful sleep and waking moments of bewildering clarity, the doctors spoke in hushed tones of remarkable stabilization, a puzzling turn. Dr. Anya Sharma, usually so precise and pragmatic, looked genuinely baffled. Ms. Jenkins, she said, her brow furrowed, your white blood cell count, while still low, has begun to climb. Slowly, yes, but it's real. And your FLT3 ITD activity, it's significantly decreased. Not gone, not a remission in the complete sense, but a partial response. Enough to give your body a fighting chance against the infection. Chloe listened, a profound sense of wonder blossoming within her. She felt it, an almost imperceptible shift in her bones, a faint stirring of energy where there had been only emptiness. It wasn't a miracle cure, she knew that. The AML was still there, a shadow that would likely always linger, but something fundamental had changed. The crushing fatigue had lessened its grip. The persistent ache in her joints had dulled. She could breathe without constant effort, taste without pain. She looked at Dr. Sharma, then at Leo, who was watching her with cautious hope. It was the stories, Chloe rasped, her voice still weak but clear enough to convey conviction. The stories healed me. Dr. Sharma blinked, her professional skepticism warring with the undeniable medical data. Leo, however, understood. He had seen the transformation, the subtle shift in her focus, the nascent empathy that had replaced her fierce intellectual rigidity. Chloe closed her eyes, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She knew with an unshakable certainty that her physical body had found a pathway to healing, not through her relentless pursuit of facts, but through the profound, illogical, deeply human act of connection. By giving voice to others, she had somehow given her own body a reason to live. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer a solitary battle against a cunning enemy. It was part of a much larger, unfolding story, and for the first time in a very long time, Chloe felt truly, vibrantly alive. The internal maelstrom of Chloe's delirium intensified, a kaleidoscope of fragmented memories and borrowed narratives. The young mother's desperate plea for her child's life intertwined with the metallic tang of hospital antiseptic. The veteran's recounting of battlefield horrors bled into the chilling echo of the doctor's grim prognosis. And then, a new, sharper image pierced through the fog. A small, pale face, almost translucent, framed by wispy blonde hair. Her sister, Lily. Lily, who had coughed relentlessly, her breath growing shallower with each passing day. Dismissed by their parents as a stubborn cold, until she simply stopped. Chloe, a precocious 9-year-old, had watched helpless as the light left Lily's eyes, a silent witness to a mystery that remained unsolved, undiagnosed. The memory long buried resurfaced with visceral clarity, a cold hand gripping her heart. It was then, in that moment of raw, unvarnished fear and a buried grief finally unearthed, that Chloe understood the root of her lifelong quest for answers, for control, for the truth that had eluded her in Lily's passing. It wasn't just professional skepticism. It was a deeply personal, desperate need to understand, to prevent, to name the unseen enemy. She felt herself falling, not just into unconsciousness, but into a vast, silent void. The voices faded, the bright shards of light dissolved, and the cold touch of medical instruments receded. There was only a profound stillness, a sense of boundless, infinite space. It wasn't frightening, it was peaceful. A whisper, or perhaps a thought, formed in her mind. Let go. And for the first time in her fiercely controlled life, Chloe did. She released the grip on her own narrative, on her need for answers, on her fear of the unknown. She simply existed, a single infinitesimal point in the vastness. Then a faint warmth began to spread, emanating from deep within her chest, like a nascent sun. It wasn't the fiery heat of infection, but a gentle, pervasive glow. The stillness persisted, but now it was imbued with a quiet hum, a vibration that resonated with the forgotten stories she had collected. Elias's gentle wisdom, the young mother's fierce love, the veteran's resilient spirit. They were not just memories, but living presences, threads woven into the fabric of her own being. She felt them, not as external entities, but as part of her own burgeoning strength. Slowly, agonizingly, Chloe began to surface. The first sensation was a subtle shift in the air, no longer the oppressive weight of her delirium, but a lighter, crisper breath. Then the rhythmic hiss returned, softer now, less demanding. She felt a familiar pressure on her hand, Leo's. She tried to squeeze it, and to her astonishment, her fingers responded, weak but present. A faint, sweet scent, perhaps of oranges, drifted past her. She opened her eyes, and the world, though still blurred, was no longer fractured. The harsh overhead lights were muted, casting a soft glow on the familiar ceiling tiles. Leo was there, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly. He looked exhausted, his face etched with worry lines she hadn't noticed before. As if sensing her awakening, he slowly lifted his head. His eyes, swollen and red-rimmed, met hers. For a moment, he just stared, disbelief warring with a fragile hope. "Chloe?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a reedy croak. She managed a faint nod. A tidal wave of relief washed over Leo's face. Tears, fresh and unrestrained, welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. He tightened his grip on her hand, burying his face against her arm. "Oh, Chloe, I thought you were gone," his voice cracked. A nurse, a kind-faced woman named Maria, who had been particularly attentive, entered the room and gasped softly. She quickly checked Chloe's vitals, her movements precise and professional, but her eyes held a genuine astonishment. "Her fever broke," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "Her pressure's stabilizing. This is remarkable. Remarkable indeed." Over the next few days, the medical team remained cautiously optimistic, their scientific explanations struggling to keep pace with the inexplicable reality of Chloe's turnaround. The septic shock, which had threatened to consume her, was receding. Her white blood cell count, though still low, had begun a slow, steady climb from critical levels. But the true enigma was her AML. While not a complete eradication, scans revealed a surprising, albeit partial, remission in her bone marrow. The aggressive FLT3-ITD mutation, the one that had given her such a grim prognosis, showed significantly decreased activity. The doctors, accustomed to the relentless progression of her disease, could only describe it as an anomalous response or an unforeseen partial molecular remission. They spoke of the body's incredible resilience, of the complex interplay of factors, but Chloe knew. Lying in her bed, still weak but with a clarity she hadn't experienced in months, Chloe felt a profound, quiet certainty. It wasn't the esoteric supplements nor the extreme diets. It wasn't even the aggressive medical interventions that had come in the crisis, though she acknowledged their critical role in pulling her back from the brink. It was the stories, the act of bearing witness, of opening herself to the narratives of others, had somehow, miraculously, begun to heal her. Not just spiritually, but physically. The deep-seated need for control, the rigid intellectualism born from a childhood trauma, had finally been released, allowing something new, something vital to take root. She looked at Leo, his face still tired but now alight with hope, and felt a profound sense of gratitude, a peace that transcended her lingering physical discomfort. The defiance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a quiet humility and an unshakable belief in the power of connection. Her body, once an enemy, now felt like a surprising ally, a testament to a shift in her very essence. It was a miracle, not of divine intervention, but of human connection, of empathy, of a narrative finally unbound.